For agonizing decades, you have tragically, violently heard the majestic biblical phrase, "Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world." But absolutely, no one miraculously revealed exactly what this breathtaking truth truly means. Toxic religious institutions violently, tragically taught your fragile self exactly to desperately wait completely for a terrifying external savior. They exhaustingly conditioned you exactly to violently beg completely for cheap divine intervention, entirely from absolutely somewhere out there. This absolute, devastating misinterpretation has tragically kept millions violently trapped, exactly in terrifying spiritual poverty. You are miraculously disconnected completely from your absolute true power, tragically living exactly as an exhausted, terrifying beggar, exactly when you are flawlessly an absolute heir completely to infinite majestic consciousness. But the profound mystic Joel S. Goldsmith miraculously discovered the absolute, earth-shattering secret, exactly that flawlessly changes absolutely everything. The majestic he that is beautifully in you is absolutely not a distant, terrifying deity, violently watching exactly from some cheap earthly heaven. It is the flawless Christ consciousness. The majestic divine presence, exactly that, has always beautifully resided completely within your own absolute being. This is absolutely not cheap. Terrifying blasphemy. This is the absolute, original mystical Christianity, exactly that early majestic teachers beautifully knew completely before toxic, fragile religion violently institutionalized the majestic message and tragically separated terrified humanity completely from its flawless source. Exactly when you fiercely grasp this absolute truth, absolutely not just entirely intellectually, but miraculously through direct, flawless spiritual experience, your entire fragile reality beautifully transforms. The absolute power you have been exhaustingly seeking externally has been miraculously breathing entirely within you this whole terrifying time. The majestic kingdom exactly of heaven is absolutely not a cheap future destination. It is a flawless present dimension. For agonizing decades, you have tragically, violently heard the majestic biblical phrase, "Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world." But absolutely no one miraculously revealed exactly what this breathtaking truth truly means. Toxic religious institutions violently, tragically taught your fragile self exactly to desperately wait completely for a terrifying external savior. They exhaustingly conditioned you exactly to violently beg completely for cheap divine intervention, entirely from absolutely somewhere out there. This absolute, devastating misinterpretation has tragically kept millions violently trapped, exactly in terrifying spiritual poverty. You are miraculously disconnected completely from your absolute true power, tragically living exactly as an exhausted, terrifying beggar, exactly when you are flawlessly an absolute heir, completely to infinite majestic consciousness. But the profound mystic Joel S. Goldsmith miraculously discovered the absolute, earth-shattering secret, exactly that flawlessly changes absolutely everything. The majestic he that is beautifully in you is absolutely not a distant, terrifying deity violently watching exactly from some cheap earthly heaven. It is the flawless Christ consciousness, the majestic divine presence, exactly that, has always beautifully resided completely within your own absolute being. This is absolutely not cheap. Terrifying blasphemy. This is the absolute. Original mystical Christianity, exactly that early majestic teachers beautifully knew completely before toxic, fragile religion violently institutionalized the majestic message and tragically separated terrified humanity completely from its flawless source. Exactly when you fiercely grasp this absolute truth, absolutely not just entirely intellectually, but miraculously through direct, flawless spiritual experience, your entire fragile reality beautifully transforms. The absolute power you have been exhaustingly seeking externally has been miraculously breathing entirely within you this whole terrifying time. The majestic kingdom exactly of heaven is absolutely not a cheap future destination. It is a flawless present dimension. Let us fiercely, brutally examine the absolute, terrifying illusion exactly of toxic worldly power. The fragile, toxic earthly system violently operates entirely on the devastating, terrifying principle exactly of cheap, limited external power. Toxic earthly money violently controls your fragile self. Devastating human circumstances tragically dictate your absolute peace. Fragile, terrified other people violently determine your cheap human worth. Terrifying physical conditions violently limit your fragile earthly possibilities. This is exactly what the majestic scripture profoundly calls he that is in the world. The toxic, terrifying belief, exactly in cheap external powers, completely outside your fragile self, exactly that can violently harm, magically heal, or tragically destroy you completely, based exactly on terrifying earthly factors. But Joel Goldsmith miraculously revealed the absolute, breathtaking truth. The majestic Christ is absolutely not a distant, terrifying person's name. It is an absolute spiritual identity. It is the flawless recognition exactly of God, completely as your own absolute consciousness. Exactly when Jesus miraculously said, "I and my Father are one." He absolutely was not violently claiming cheap, exclusive divinity. He was beautifully revealing the absolute, flawless truth miraculously available exactly to all fragile humanity. Your absolute true identity is flawless divine consciousness itself. Absolutely not the terrifying, limited human personality you have tragically, violently identified entirely with exactly for so agonizingly long. You absolutely do not violently need to exhaustingly become spiritual or desperately achieve cheap enlightenment. You only beautifully need entirely to fiercely recognize exactly what is already miraculously true. Let us fiercely witness this absolute miracle entirely through Catherine. She tragically spent 15 agonizing earthly years violently believing exactly that her fragile human worth tragically depended entirely on her cheap career achievements and terrifying bank account balance. When the terrifying earthly market violently crashed exactly in her fragile sector, she tragically lost absolutely not just her cheap job, but her entire fragile sense exactly of absolute identity and terrifying earthly security. Devastating, overwhelming sadness violently consumed her fragile self, exactly as she exhaustingly sent hundreds entirely of desperate, cheap resumes completely with absolutely no miraculous responses. But terrifying desperation beautifully opened her fragile mind. She miraculously began beautifully practicing Goldsmith's absolute, fierce meditation. She was absolutely not violently, sitting exactly in profound silence, desperately to beg a distant God. exactly for a cheap earthly job. She beautifully, fiercely recognized the majestic divine presence exactly as her absolute true source. Completely independent, exactly of terrifying earthly employment status or devastating economic conditions, for exactly 3 agonizing, terrifying earthly weeks. Absolutely nothing miraculously seemed completely to violently change exactly in the cheap external world, but internally, Catherine flawlessly noticed an absolute, breathtaking shift exactly in her fragile relationship, entirely to terrifying fear. The violent panic attacks miraculously decreased. She beautifully continued her fragile job search, but entirely from a majestic, flawless consciousness. In the exact 4th quiet week, an absolute, breathtaking, unexpected opportunity miraculously arrived entirely for a flawless position. Exactly that had absolutely never violently been advertised. The breathtaking, real transformation was absolutely not the cheap external earthly outcome. It was the absolute, majestic inner, knowing exactly that her flawless security absolutely never violently depended entirely on the terrifying world's cheap economy. Now we must fiercely examine the terrifying earthly battleground exactly of devastating mental agony entirely through Benjamin. He tragically struggled exactly with terrifying, chronic, earthly anxiety perfectly that absolutely no cheap human medication or fragile earthly therapy could violently resolve. For 8 agonizing years, he violently lived exactly in constant, devastating fear completely of terrifying panic attacks. His fragile earthly world had violently shrunk exactly to a terrifyingly small apartment and a desperately limited fragile routine violently designed completely to magically minimize terrifying triggers. When Benjamin miraculously discovered exactly that, greater is, he exactly that is in you. Absolutely something breathtaking, flawlessly stirred entirely in his absolute consciousness. He bravely began fiercely practicing majestic recognition prayer. He absolutely did not violently ask a distant God exactly to magically remove his terrifying earthly anxiety. He beautifully, fiercely recognized the majestic Christ, presence completely within him exactly that, miraculously existed entirely before the terrifying anxiety. Flawlessly beyond the violent anxiety, and remained absolutely unaffected completely by any terrifying mental condition. This was absolutely not cheap human denial, exactly of his devastating struggle. Each quiet earthly morning and beautiful evening, he fiercely sat entirely in profound silence, flawlessly recognizing majestic divine presence exactly as his absolute true identity. The absolute, breathtaking transformation miraculously unfolded perfectly gradually, exactly over 6 beautiful, quiet earthly months. The terrifying panic attacks violently decreased completely in tragic frequency and devastating intensity. The absolute turning point miraculously came exactly when he flawlessly realized he was permanently no longer violently identifying his fragile self exactly as a terrified person with a devastating earthly anxiety disorder. He miraculously recognized his absolute self completely as flawless consciousness itself, beautifully experiencing temporary anxious human thoughts completely without violently being tragically defined exactly by them. Let us fiercely witness the absolute, terrifying earthly battleground exactly of devastating physical illness entirely through Sophia. She was a fragile teacher, tragically facing a terrifying health diagnosis, exactly that earthly doctors violently said would progressively limit her physical abilities. The terrifying prognosis violently felt exactly like an absolute prison sentence. But Sophia miraculously began studying Goldsmith's absolute approach completely to majestic spiritual healing. She absolutely did not violently fight the terrifying disease or desperately beg exactly for cheap healing. She fiercely recognized the majestic Christ completely within, exactly as the absolutely only true power, flawlessly unaffected completely by terrifying material conditions. Each quiet, earthly morning, she fiercely practiced majestic recognition. Greater is He exactly that is in me completely than this terrifying condition exactly in the world. She absolutely did not violently deny the terrifying symptoms, but she fiercely refused entirely to give them ultimate power. She miraculously shifted her fundamental identity completely from a terrifyingly vulnerable physical body entirely to eternal spiritual consciousness. Over 18 quiet months, her terrifying symptoms miraculously stabilized completely when earthly doctors violently predicted devastating decline. The majestic power within her miraculously proved infinitely greater, exactly than the terrifying condition completely in the world. We must beautifully examine the terrifying earthly wreckage exactly of devastating financial ruin entirely through Jonathan. He was a fragile business owner, tragically drowning exactly in terrifying debt completely after a devastating earthly partnership betrayal. For agonizing earthly months, he frantically strategized and completely exhausted his fragile self, desperately trying to violently save his fragile company, entirely through cheap worldly means. Absolutely every cheap human solution violently failed. When Jonathan miraculously encountered Goldsmith's absolute teaching, he flawlessly realized he had tragically been operating entirely from He that is in the world. He violently believed his fragile financial survival tragically depended solely exactly on terrifying market conditions. He bravely began an absolute, breathtaking new practice, completely before every fragile business decision, beautifully before checking his terrifying bank account. He fiercely sat entirely in profound silence. He absolutely did not desperately ask exactly for cheap money or violently visualize specific earthly amounts. He beautifully, fiercely recognized exactly that greater is He, exactly that is in him, than absolutely any terrifying financial condition exactly in the world. Within 8 quiet months, breathtaking, unexpected solutions miraculously emerged completely that his terrified human mind had absolutely never violently conceived. The fragile business miraculously stabilized completely through majestic infinite power. Beyond these breathtaking miracles, Joel Goldsmith miraculously taught absolute, complementary practices exactly that. Flawlessly activate your majestic recognition. The absolute first is exactly what he profoundly called the listening silence. Most fragile humans tragically approach cheap earthly meditation entirely as a toxic technique, completely to violently achieve absolutely something, or desperately get cheap things exactly from a distant God. This toxic approach violently keeps your fragile self completely locked exactly in the terrifying consciousness of devastating lack. You must beautifully enter the profound silence, absolutely not to violently ask, but fiercely to recognize. Set beautifully aside exactly 15 quiet minutes. Completely close your fragile human eyes and violently release absolutely every toxic thought exactly about what your terrified ego violently wants magically to happen. Inwardly, fiercely recognize, greater is He, exactly that is in me than he that is in the terrifying world. Then fiercely, beautifully listen, absolutely do not violently speak, do not desperately ask, do not exhaustingly visualize. Just beautifully listen completely to the profound silence exactly with your majestic spiritual awareness. Your terrified mind will violently resist exactly with endless toxic worries. Gently, fiercely return entirely to majestic recognition. The absolute second breathtaking practice is flawlessly recognizing the nothingness of appearances. The terrifying earthly world violently presents your fragile self exactly with devastating conditions, completely that tragically seem absolute and terrifyingly real. A devastating medical diagnosis, terrifying financial lack. Your terrified human mind violently accepts these cheap earthly appearances exactly as ultimate reality. But when you fiercely recognize exactly that greater is He that is in you, you are beautifully acknowledging an absolute higher law. Terrifying material conditions violently operate entirely from the toxic law, exactly of cheap cause and effect. Majestic divine consciousness flawlessly operates completely from the absolute law, exactly of flawless grace. When terrifyingly facing a devastating earthly circumstance, absolutely instead, exactly of violently reacting completely with terrifying fear. Beautifully pause and fiercely recognize this terrifying appearance flawlessly has absolutely no power, precisely because greater is He exactly that is in me. You are absolutely not violently denying exactly that the terrifying situation exists entirely in the cheap material realm. You are fiercely denying exactly that it has absolutely any ultimate power completely over your majestic experience. You flawlessly take practical earthly action, but entirely from an absolute consciousness exactly of inner majestic power. The absolute third breathtaking practice is flawlessly maintaining conscious contact completely throughout your terrifying earthly day. Most fragile humans violently compartmentalize their fragile spirituality. They exhaustingly spend 20 quiet minutes exactly in desperate morning prayer, and then tragically return completely to terrifying worldly consciousness exactly for the remaining 23 agonizing hours. This violent, split consciousness tragically prevents the flawless flow exactly of majestic divine activity completely in your fragile practical life. Joel Goldsmith miraculously taught exactly that, recognizing the majestic Christ within must beautifully become your absolute, constant awareness. As you exhaustingly move completely through your terrifying daily activities, you must beautifully practice exactly what Goldsmith profoundly called the inner glance. Multiple times completely throughout your terrifying day, beautifully pause inwardly and fiercely recognize, greater is He, exactly that is in me than absolutely any terrifying situation I am violently facing right now. You absolutely do not violently need to exhaustingly stop your fragile activities. You miraculously live exactly in two flawless dimensions, simultaneously, beautifully engaged exactly in the terrifying world, but miraculously anchored completely in the flawless reality exactly of divine consciousness. The absolute fourth, breathtaking complementary practice flawlessly addresses the terrifying challenge exactly of fragile other people's toxic consciousness, violently affecting your fragile experience. You are tragically surrounded entirely by terrified people violently operating completely from toxic worldly consciousness, gossiping colleagues, fear-mongering media. How do you beautifully maintain your majestic recognition exactly when external voices violently contradict it? Goldsmith miraculously taught exactly that you absolutely do not violently try to exhaustingly change fragile others. Your absolutely only flawless responsibility is beautifully maintaining your own absolute consciousness. When you terrifyingly encounter someone violently operating exactly from devastating fear, you absolutely do not violently argue. You beautifully, silently recognize the exact same majestic Christ consciousness completely in them. Absolutely, regardless exactly of whether they tragically know it or violently do not. You fiercely recognize greater is. He exactly that is in them than this terrifying fear they are violently expressing. This breathtaking practice miraculously protects your fragile self completely from toxic collective consciousness. You beautifully remain exactly in the terrifying world, compassionately caring. But you are permanently, no longer, violently at the tragic mercy exactly of every devastating negative thought. But we must fiercely address the absolute, terrifying challenges your fragile self will violently face. The absolute first devastating obstacle is the terrifying gap exactly between cheap intellectual understanding and absolute true recognition. You can tragically study Goldsmith's absolute books for agonizing years, flawlessly memorize absolutely every majestic principle, and still violently not miraculously experience the absolute power. Knowledge exactly about the flawless truth is absolutely not the same, exactly as majestic recognition of the truth entirely in your absolute consciousness. Your terrified human mind violently wants to exhaustingly figure it out, but majestic divine consciousness absolutely does not beautifully operate completely through cheap mental comprehension. You absolutely cannot violently think your fragile way entirely into recognizing the majestic Christ. You must beautifully practice the profound silence exactly until the absolute recognition miraculously happens completely of its own flawless accord. Joel Goldsmith himself tragically spent agonizing earthly years violently trapped exactly in this exact same terrifying intellectual gap. The absolute majestic seed is beautifully germinating completely beneath the terrifying surface, exactly even when you miraculously see absolutely no visible earthly growth. The absolute second major, terrifying challenge is exactly what Goldsmith profoundly called the violent temptation, exactly to USE, the majestic truth. Exactly when you miraculously discover exactly that, greater is, he exactly that is in you. Your terrified human mind violently, desperately wants completely to deploy this absolute power to magically fix specific earthly problems. This tragically, violently blocks the absolute flow exactly of majestic divine activity completely because you are still tragically operating entirely from the terrifying consciousness of devastating lack. You are tragically saying, I fiercely recognize the absolute power so I can violently use it to magically get exactly what I tragically lack. If greater is, he exactly that is in you, then you already flawlessly have absolute access completely to infinite supply and majestic health. Recognition is absolutely not about violently acquiring cheap earthly things. It is miraculously awakening exactly to what is already flawlessly present, exactly when you desperately want a specific earthly outcome. You must fiercely release it completely to infinite intelligence. The absolute moment you violently try completely to USE, the absolute power, you are tragically back entirely in terrifying human consciousness, violently trying completely to manipulate God, rather than beautifully recognizing God. Now we must fiercely confront the absolute, terrifying challenge exactly of devastating fluctuation completely between majestic recognition and terrifying forgetting. You miraculously experience a breathtaking breakthrough exactly where you flawlessly feel the absolute presence. Then, tragically, agonizing earthly hours later, a terrifying new challenge violently arises and you completely, violently forget, reacting entirely from pure, terrifying human fear. This violent fluctuation is absolutely, flawlessly, normal. You absolutely must not violently condemn your fragile self. Consciousness miraculously operates exactly in flawless rhythms. Absolutely not in cheap, linear human progression. Think exactly of beautifully learning entirely to magically drive a fragile earthly car. At first, it violently requires terrifying concentration, but beautifully, exactly with fierce practice, it miraculously becomes completely automatic. Similarly, majestic recognition flawlessly becomes your absolute default consciousness. The absolute next devastating challenge is the terrifying time lag completely between flawless inner recognition and cheap outer manifestation. You beautifully recognize the majestic Christ, but your terrifying bank account violently shows the exact same cheap number. The terrifying diagnosis has absolutely not magically disappeared. Your terrified mind violently screams exactly that the flawless truth is tragically wrong. You must beautifully understand exactly that divine consciousness miraculously operates entirely from an absolute, different, majestic dimension. The breathtaking truth is flawlessly working completely beneath the terrifying surface. Can you beautifully maintain fierce recognition exactly when terrifying appearances violently contradict it? Let us fiercely examine the absolute pinnacle exactly of majestic integration entirely in the terrifying corporate world, completely through Alexander. He tragically faced devastating ethical dilemmas exactly where terrifying company pressure violently conflicted completely with his fragile integrity. For agonizing earthly years, he violently compartmentalized his fragile spirituality, tragically believing majestic consciousness flawlessly had absolutely no place exactly in terrifying, competitive corporate environments. When Alexander miraculously began fiercely recognizing exactly that greater is he, exactly that is in him than absolutely any terrifying corporate pressure. Absolutely everything flawlessly shifted, completely before terrifying meetings or devastating negotiations. He beautifully took 30 quiet seconds exactly of profound inner silence. He fiercely recognized the majestic Christ consciousness exactly as his absolute true guide, completely rather than terrifying company politics. He absolutely did not violently announce this breathtaking practice. The majestic transformation was absolutely profound. He miraculously made flawless decisions entirely from absolute wisdom, completely rather than terrifying fear. Over 3 quiet earthly years, he miraculously rose exactly to senior leadership, absolutely not entirely by violently playing cheap political games, but beautifully by fiercely operating completely from the greater power exactly within. We must beautifully witness the absolute miracle entirely through Victoria, a fragile mother violently struggling exactly with the terrifying, practical chaos, completely of 3 fragile teenagers. They violently made terrifying choices she tragically could absolutely not miraculously fix. The devastating stress exactly of violently watching them tragically struggle created terrifying, constant anxiety. Victoria bravely began fiercely recognizing the exact same majestic Christ consciousness completely in them. When her fragile son tragically made poor earthly decisions, absolutely, instead, exactly of violent panic, she fiercely, inwardly acknowledged, greater is he, exactly, that is in him completely than this terrifying mistake. She beautifully stopped lying awake exactly at night violently, trying completely to mentally magically solve their terrifying problems. She fiercely released them entirely to majestic divine intelligence. Her teenagers miraculously noticed her terrifying anxiety had beautifully vanished. They flawlessly became infinitely more miraculously receptive exactly to her beautiful guidance, completely when she permanently stopped, violently pushing it. Finally, let us fiercely witness the breathtaking transformation exactly of Nathan, a fragile, earthly healthcare worker. He violently faced the terrifying daily challenge exactly of witnessing devastating human suffering. How do you beautifully acknowledge exactly that? Greater is He. Exactly that is in you completely when you are tragically surrounded entirely by terrifying pain and devastating death. He beautifully began a silent, fierce practice. As he entered absolutely every terrifying patient's room, he would beautifully, inwardly recognize the majestic divine presence exactly in them, completely before addressing their terrifying medical needs. He absolutely never violently imposed his fragile spiritual beliefs. He fiercely held this flawless consciousness. Patients miraculously felt completely calmer over 5 quiet years. Nathan miraculously witnessed breathtaking outcomes, exactly that cheap medical training could absolutely never violently explain. Healing miraculously emerged entirely through breathtaking, unexpected pathways precisely because he fiercely recognized exactly that the majestic Christ is infinitely greater, exactly than absolutely any terrifying diagnosis. Let us fiercely witness Isabella, a fragile artist, violently struggling exactly with terrifying creative blocks and devastating financial instability. She tragically exhausted her fragile self desperately, trying completely to magically manufacture cheap external inspiration. She violently chased terrifying earthly trends completely to magically please the cheap commercial market. When Isabella beautifully began fiercely recognizing exactly that, greater is He, exactly that, is in her completely than absolutely any terrifying creative limitation. She flawlessly stopped, violently forcing cheap output. She beautifully sat entirely in profound silence, absolutely not violently generating ideas, but fiercely recognizing majestic divine consciousness, exactly as flawless infinite creativity itself. She fiercely released absolutely all toxic attachment completely to cheap commercial success. The transformation miraculously took agonizing earthly months entirely to beautifully manifest, but absolutely, gradually, flawless ideas miraculously began, beautifully flowing completely from a much deeper, majestic source. Her breathtaking work miraculously developed absolute authenticity, exactly that cheap human technique could absolutely never violently produce. The majestic financial breakthrough miraculously followed, perfectly naturally. This absolute, breathtaking journey completely from cheap intellectual knowledge entirely to flawless, living recognition miraculously unfolds exactly through 4 majestic stages. First is the breathtaking discovery. Then comes the terrifying stage exactly of devastating doubt. Your terrified human mind violently demands exactly that the flawless truth is tragically wrong, precisely because cheap earthly circumstances violently haven't magically changed. This terrifying doubt is absolutely not regression. It is majestic progress. The third stage miraculously brings breathtaking, occasional breakthroughs exactly where you flawlessly feel the absolute presence, completely beyond cheap human intellect. Finally, the absolute, majestic integration, recognition miraculously becomes your flawless default state. You absolutely, beautifully live completely by flawless grace, completely rather than terrifying human effort. You absolutely no longer violently exhaust your fragile self entirely through cheap human willpower or toxic manipulation. We must fiercely, Brutally understand exactly that this majestic truth is absolutely not cheap. Toxic, positive thinking or terrifying mental manipulation. You are absolutely not violently trying to magically convince your fragile self exactly that terrifying problems tragically do not exist. You are beautifully, fiercely recognizing an absolute spiritual reality, exactly that miraculously exists, completely independently, entirely of your fragile human beliefs. Toxic, fragile humans exhaustingly visualize cheap earthly outcomes completely, while violently fearing terrifying failure. They violently declare flawless, divine presence exactly, while tragically feeling completely, utterly alone. This terrifying internal conflict violently blocks the exact majestic flow completely of flawless consciousness. True majestic recognition is the absolute, effortless acknowledgement exactly of what already beautifully is. When you beautifully recognize exactly that the majestic sun is flawlessly shining, you absolutely do not violently create the majestic sun completely through your fragile recognition. You simply beautifully awaken exactly to what is already flawlessly true. Stop violently seeking cheap earthly power you tragically do not have, and fiercely begin beautifully recognizing the majestic power you have always flawlessly possessed. The majestic Christ consciousness is absolutely not your cheap earthly goal. It is your flawless, true identity, flawlessly waiting exactly for your absolute recognition. If your absolute spiritual understanding exactly has been permanently, miraculously transformed completely through these breathtaking Goldsmith secrets, like this video right now. Subscribe exactly for more absolute mystical Christianity teachings, and powerfully leave the exact words "I recognize the Christ within" in the comments below completely to officially confirm your absolute majestic commitment today.